Hilditch House, written and read by Chris Halton. Sat brooding over a green and verdant valley of fine firs and sheltering rhododendrons lies Hilditch House, standing imperiously atop a stony Cumberland crag and staring down disdainfully from arched windows into a valley below. Built in the late 19th century, this four-bedroom house with tall funnelled chimneys, weathered stone walls and gargoyles aggressively guarding corners looks rather incongruous within its surroundings. This notion of architectural hostility is further emphasised by a large front porch with a huge black-painted door encasing space white rectangular glass door lights resembling a monster's teeth, adding further unease to the unwary visitor. The house had not received guests for many years, as its last owner took to the family with a meat cleaver, and at night wails and screams are sometimes heard on the wind being funneled through the surrounding hills and into the dark encapsulating forests. On a dark wintry night in 1947, George Malpas's Austin, Norfolk saloon spluttered and broke down on a winding valley road as he desperately tried to get to Carlisle, where a hotel room had been reserved. Driving through heavy gusting rain had been difficult enough, but in the end a broken fan belt triumphed over the fortitude of nature with its maelstrom from hell. He put on a raincoat and hat and looked desperately for any sign of human habitation in this unedifying, hostile environment. He was whipped hard by rain and wind, striking in waves as he searched desperately for shelter. Good fortune appeared when he saw lights from the gloom on the hill above the road. Approaching it quickly by a detritus-ridden track smeared with algaeic slime, he eventually arrived at the door of a sanctuary with its house lights beaming into the darkness. He rapped the heavy brass knocker hard, and very shortly it was answered by an elderly lady of small stature who appeared in her late 70s. She was neat and trim and had a warm, engaging smile below her small, round-framed glasses. "Come in, please," she implored, tugging the sleeve of his raincoat to emphasize the urgency of the situation. He duly followed her into a large, spacious Victorian-era hallway, where she took his hat and coat and placed them on the hooks of an ornate mahogany hall stand. The hall and the house were warm, brightly lit, and felt welcoming. By way of introduction, she said, "My name is Ellie, and I live here with my daughter, son-in-law, and their children. However, tonight I have the house to myself, as they are away for a while and will not be returning soon." She smiled, looked up at him, and said, "Terrible night tonight, isn't it? How may I help you?" "My car broke down on the road and I must get to Carlisle tonight. Could I borrow your telephone to make a call? I am more than happy to pay the cost of it." She apologetically replied, "I wish I could help, but the wind took down my telephone wire. I'm afraid you are stuck here for at least tonight, but be rest assured I won't allow you to leave until morning, as I can let you sleep in my daughter's bedroom. I changed the bedding there, so it's nice and fresh, and you will feel comfortable. That I can guarantee." She paused, looked slightly confused, and continued, "Oh yes, before I forget, I have a friend nearby who you can get to in the morning, and he can run you into Carlisle." He thanked her and felt relieved. He may finally be able to meet his commitments, as his meeting is essential for his small engineering company in Preston, Lancashire, as he has arranged to meet with a prospective client from Scotland who has travelled down from Edinburgh. She then said, "The weather must be making you feel chilled. Let's go to the kitchen, and I'll make you a nice cup of tea while you relax next to the wood stove." With that he followed her, and sat in a Windsor chair beside the blazing warmth from the open stove door. Feeling happy at his change of fortune, he rubbed his hands excitedly against the heat. She then poured a large, refreshing cup of tea from a teapot resting atop the stove, and after adding milk and sugar to his requirements, he sat back and gently drank the amber liquid while looking around the kitchen. Although dated, the kitchen was well laid out and clean. It had a fine Westmoreland oak dresser neatly filled with blue and white china cups, saucers and plates. The Belfast sink looked immaculate, and the water was supplied from an old-fashioned hand pump that extracted clean and fresh water from an aquifer below. As Ellie busied herself in the kitchen and making small talk, he noticed she too was somewhat dated in her manner of clothing and looked more Edwardian than someone dressed for post-World War II Britain. But then again, quite a few grannies still dressed in the clothes of their youth and thought nothing more about it. He felt as though he was at home, and all seemed cosily familiar to his own family background. Whilst chatting, she spoke of her daughter Emily, her son-in-law Alfred, and her twin grandchildren Sarah and Thomas, aged 8. He asked where they were, and she told him they were visiting Alfred's relations and wouldn't return soon. She said she felt lonely on a terrible night like tonight, and she was grateful for company with such a lovely young man. He smiled, and then she lifted a cake dish lid on a pine kitchen table which contained a freshly baked ginger cake. "Would you care for a slice? Made it myself barely an hour ago." George was happy to try a slice, as he hadn't eaten for a few hours, and the journey getting here gave him quite an appetite. The cake was delicious when cut in a wedge and served on a small plate from the dresser. What a stroke of luck, he mused quietly, to meet such a lovely and agreeable lady. Feeling more at home and less of a house guest, George spoke of his family, his dear wife Margaret and his daughter Julie, whom he missed terribly. Ellie replied, "I understand fully. So are you away often, or is this a rare outing to Cumberland?" George looked rather glum when he replied that he was often away, as business was tight in the aftermath of war, and he was forever chasing new clients for his company and its 10 employees who relied on him for work. She looked somewhat miffed and said, "Don't you think your family comes first?" Surprised at her reaction, he put down his plate and replied emphatically, "If I didn't do this, Ellie, I wouldn't be able to support my family. I have little choice." Apologetically, she responded, "I am sorry if I sound harsh, but Alfred is like that, never at home and always away. The children are often sad when their father isn't here. He is a sales rep and travels a lot. My poor daughter." She broke off, changing the subject to life living in the Lake District, and once more she returned to her earlier self, asking if he wanted some ham and cheese sandwiches, as she saw the cake gave him an appetite. He thanked her, and that momentary spat passed very quickly. After eating, they retired to the front lounge, a well-maintained room filled with Victoriana. The centerpiece mahogany panel picture frame over the fireplace depicted a daguerreotype-like image of children and fairies playing in a glade. The fire surround was of an elegant cast-iron design, with flowery motifs scrolling around the supports and top. It was surmounted by a long, flat-panelled edge that displayed China Staffordshire figurines. With a roaring and welcoming hot coal fire in its grate, it felt more like a homecoming than a car breakdown. Nestling against the heavy Victorian drapes was a beautiful bonheur du jour writing desk and an elegant rococo chaise longue. George remarked on these items, and Ellie said they came from a country house sale at Derwent, which her father had bought many years ago. They chatted about the furnishings and fittings of the house, which George admired a lot. Ellie then got up and, from a drinks cabinet, gave him a brandy in a glass as a night tonic, which George drank. George soon felt sleepy and was ready for bed. Ellie took him upstairs to the master bedroom, which had a lit fire and a very comfortable bed. She said, "Sleep well, George, and don't worry about a thing." As she left the room, she turned towards him with a smile and bade him good night. She then gently closed the door, and George heard her on the staircase returning downstairs. He washed himself with a water jug and bowl set on a washstand, and having prepared himself, clambered into bed and soon fell asleep. George could not remember what time it was as he awoke in the night feeling dizzy and disorientated as though he had been drugged. His vision was blurry. In this state of torpor, he was sure he could see two children, a boy and a girl, staring at him from the foot of the bed in the weak light of a nightlight candle still burning on a side table. George, though, was unable to speak. He wanted to scream and move, but he could not do so. A woman joined them, and all three stared coldly at him before they faded into nothingness. Who or what were these people, he reasoned to himself? Delirium caused by his paralysis, or some mental malady caused by the stress of life? He was frightened and confused, but there was little he could do other than close his eyes, and with that his head spun, and he passed out. Much later he awoke again, and it was still dark, although he could now hear a freshening wind blowing outside. He could hear the sway of the trees, intertwined with the now distinct dissonant cries of children screaming for their lives, and fleetingly the sound of a woman's scream. It was horrible to listen to, it was too much to bear, but he could still not speak, and this terror left him a simpering wreck. Although he now had some movement in his limbs, gaining strength from this was impossible. So despairingly he lay there waiting silently in the apprehension and sheer terror of what may happen next. Sweat was perspiring from his brow, and his body trembled with terror. After some minutes of silence, he heard the back door downstairs open and the sound of a body being dragged outside. These sounds repeated 2 times more, and then the door slammed shut. There was more silence, and there he lay for another hour, too terrified to sleep and still barely able to speak any utterances for help. George feared for Ellie, that kind old lady who had taken him in from the cold and given him food and a bed for the night. Perhaps she fled the house for help, or is a victim of a foul crime perpetrated against her. But who were the others, ghosts or themselves, victims of a maniacal killer? Then a dreadful thought occurred to him that he might be next. His breathing became shallow when he heard a heavy thump of feet on the staircase. Someone or something was making its way slowly up the stairs, and his heart pulsated loudly in his chest with a steady thump that grew louder and louder as finally the feet reached the floor of the wooden landing outside his door. Then nothing. Whoever it was still stood outside that door and waiting in silence. George's imagination then vividly drew the imagery of some fearful blood-stained brute holding in his hand a bloodied knife, still dripping blood from the bodies of his victims that now lay cold and silent outside. George struggled to get out of bed, but he could barely lift his head or even move the digits of his fingers. His body was heavy and unresponsive, and he knew that, save a miracle from God, he was going to die in this room, and probably end up later dragged out and perhaps buried outside in the woods with the others he heard earlier. Just then he heard a gentle tap on the bedroom door. It was Ellie. "Are you okay in there? I have just been outside to use the privy, and when I returned I thought I heard you having some terrible nightmare. Do you want me to come in?" George tried to speak again, but a loud mumbling was all that struggled to leave his mouth. It was loud enough, though, for Ellie to know that he was having difficulty. She opened the door and stepped inside with an oil lamp. She said, "I use the lamp to visit the outdoor lavatory at night, so don't be alarmed." George could see that she was still dressed, and her clothing had dirt and perhaps some stains on it. She stepped closer to the bed and, holding the lamp over him, said, "Everything will be all right, Alfred. Emily, Sarah and Thomas are here waiting for you outside. We are all back together now, and you will never, ever have to leave home again." With that, a large meat cleaver was raised in her other hand, and with a smile it came crashing down into George's head. The following day, the road below Hilditch House was closed to traffic due to an accident caused by the bad weather. An Austin, Norfolk saloon had left the road on a sharp bend, crashed through a road sign, and plummeted into the woods. 2 officers from Cumberland and Westmoreland Constabulary were at the car waiting for an ambulance to remove the driver's body to Carlisle Hospital mortuary so that it could be officially declared deceased by a doctor. One officer said to the other, "This one is in a bloody mess. It looks like a road sign has sliced into his skull. Do we know who the driver was?" The other officer stared grimly at a driving licence in his hand and said, "It says here his name was George Malpas from Preston in Lancashire. I guess we best notify Preston to call his family to let them know, as someone from his family will have to attend the hospital to identify him officially." "My God," retorted the other, "this won't be a pretty sight. His head is virtually sliced in two. I'm glad I'm not the officer who has to share this." At that moment, an ambulance pulled in to park by the police car aside the road. Both officers then joined the ambulance crew, who then clambered down to retrieve George's corpse. The officers remained by the roadside while waiting for the body's removal and a tow truck to remove the wreck. One officer looked up and saw on the hill Hilditch House. Drawing the other officer's attention to it, he said, "Isn't that the house where all the murders occurred 25 years ago?" The other, lighting a pipe, replied after puffing on the bowl to draw an intense burn, "Yes, indeed. I was a young probationer when that happened. I'll never forget that so long as I live." The grandmother drugged her daughter, son-in-law and 2 grandchildren with a concoction of substances which paralysed them as they lay quietly in bed. She then took to their heads with a meat cleaver and tried to bury them outside, but the soil was too shallow, and the stench of their decaying bodies was later reported by a postman who discovered the corpses. He continued after another draw on his pipe. "Suffice it to say, the old woman was completely crazy and ended up in a mental hospital where she passed away 20 years ago. And yet when I saw her, she looked such a dear, kindly old lady." The other much younger officer interjected, "As a kid we were told the place is haunted. Just looking at it now gives me the creeps. No wonder nobody wants to buy or rent it." The pipe-puffing officer replied, "Funnily enough, thinking about the wound to the driver's head, it does look like he had been struck by a meat cleaver. What a strange old world." The end.